for me, that sticks out always as the first priority and the first kind of thing that brings my attention about climate change, why we need to make a difference. It's for these communities that actually haven't contributed, as you've said, if at all, from an emissions perspective to the climate crisis, but are facing the brunt of it and having to adapt and migrate, even, forced migration in many cases. So that, I'd say, for me, when I think of sustainability and climate change, it's always the human side that comes to mind first, and as a priority that perhaps we don't necessarily, in the broader sense, in the industry and sector in the UK, think about as quantifiable.
We are on an adventure to unite the stories and solutions of the pioneers, creating a better future for all. Together, we will journey to every continent, every country and community, and ask the question, what is the future you dream of? We will explore the blockers to us getting there, and we will ask, what will it take? What do we need? What do you need to create a future where we all thrive in balance and harmony with nature and each other?
Hello, welcome. In this episode, we welcome Vibhati Bhatia, the founder of South Asians for Sustainability and managing consultant for social sustainability at Energize. Vibs is co-partner of Race Report UK, part of SOS, or Students Organising for Sustainability, and on the advisory board for Catalyze Change, which focuses on helping 18 to 25-year-old females or non-binary people get into sustainability. This is a heart-opening adventure through inequality, injustice, and the inspiring story of how a pioneering proactivist is intentionally doing something about it. Together, we explore how a family experience of Punjab floods deepened her empathy and emboldened her to act with greater intention and intensity, the community Vibhati founded, South Asians for Sustainability, and the transformation we need to see in diversity and inclusion. We explore climate adaptation, the Loss and Damage Fund, and so much more. Listen to the end to hear ideas on how we can co-create a more empathetic and connected approach to how we transform our organisations, our roles in them, and the communities and projects that we support. You can read the action takeaways from this episode, comment, co-create future episodes, and connect with fellow changemakers in the Future Planet community of action. Visit futureplanet.love to sign in or sign up. Let's get into it. Love to welcome to the podcast Vibhati Bhatia, who is a pioneering leader and convened South Asians for Sustainability, is managing consultant for social sustainability at Energize, co-partner of the Race Report UK, part of SOS, or Students Organising for Sustainability, and advisory board for Catalyze Change, which focuses on helping 18 to 25-year-old females or non-binary people get into sustainability. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you to the podcast. And I'm really looking forward to exploring some of the themes that we will do today. Perhaps you might like to introduce yourself and then talk about some of the things that we will cover in today's podcast.
Absolutely. Thank you, Carl. It's a pleasure to be here. And I know it's been a long time coming. So as you've said, I'm Vibs, also known, my full name is Vibhati, and I have been working in sustainability for over 6 years. I've moved through different sectors. My academic background is actually in psychology, but I've always been interested in sort of behavioral change and how that impacts us as human beings, how we decide what we do, what we choose, how we live our lives, and sort of have worked in nonprofit, in retail sectors, all sustainability focused, and now in consulting. So yeah, real pleasure to be here.
Oh, pleasure. So South Asians for Sustainability feels like a nice place to start. I watched that movement grow, and it was created out of perhaps a desire or a need or something that you saw. What was that you saw?
So I quickly realized whilst I was working on different professional jobs that often whenever I went to networking events, when I sought mentorship from perhaps a person who could relate to my cultural background or my ancestry or heritage, being a British born but Indian Punjabi female, I was often the only person of color in the room, South Asian person in the room, sometimes even female in the room. And when I sought this mentorship or a community that I could reach out to specifically for South Asian people within the diaspora, I just didn't find anything online at the time. COVID had happened as well. We were all kind of locked up at home, and I had more time naturally to think through things and try and seek more connections and networking. So I guess that's where the seed for South Asians for Sustainability was sown. I managed to connect with like-minded South Asian people, all professionals, people form. They were working towards having a positive impact, whether that was in environmental sustainability or social sustainability and human rights and cultural diversity and inclusion. So reaching out to that network online through different platforms on social networks and social media, I was able to establish a fair few people who were also seeking a platform that spoke about climate change and spoke about sustainable behaviors in a way that's culturally relevant. So that was a huge gap. When it comes to our cultural identities, the festivities, we celebrate the way we live our lives, the food we eat, how we dress, nothing primarily focusing in on South Asian culture and how you can live and breathe more sustainably and, on a day-to-day life, living way. And also from a professional sense, there is a huge gap still to date. And I'm talking 5 years on. I think it's between 4 or 5% of the workforce in conservation environmental sector is of people of color compared to the otherwise 13 to 14% in the rest of the country. And it's still the second least diverse sector in our country at the minute. So there is still this huge a gap that needs to be filled. And so that's another part of South Asians for Sustainability, is highlighting the representation that does exist of professionals who are doing great work in all sorts of industries, and really creating that space and being able to share and why it's important to keep enhancing that representation.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I think there's a number of areas, perhaps 2 or 3 areas that spring to mind that we could explore there. The first I think would be curious is around representation in our movement around sustainability is intrinsically linked to the shared challenges that we have. And on the flip side, a lack of representation will distinctly affect how well we can both understand and respond in an empathetic and thoughtful and appropriate way to the challenges we have. It would be interesting to hear you speak a little bit to that, and maybe could start with perhaps the broader challenge that we find around themes like climate adaptation, different cultural sensitivities, almost a 2 or 3 tier system around support for climate change and or support for the effects of climate change or the effects of nature destruction, and what's arriving as the people that are often most affected by either climate change or nature or social challenges, often being the people that are not necessarily working in the organizations that are having that impact or working in those countries that are responsible in part for the impact that they have. And that within that mix, there's a very compelling reason why more diversity is important, but also could you speak a little bit to that, to those themes?
So one thing that I have, through the course of my career, become progressively and increasingly more passionate about is climate injustice. The more and more that we're seeing climate disasters happening in global south regions, in those countries that are a part of South Asia, and personally as well, seeing my own family impacted by severe flooding in northern regions of India, it's becoming very, very real how much climate injustice exists, how it's impacting the daily lives of people of color or marginalized communities that are already, they don't have as much opportunity for success necessarily compared to those in the global north when it comes to daily lifestyle choices, not to generalize to large amounts of communities within South Asia, but a fair few, if not majority, they are facing the brunt of this at the moment already. And so for me, that sticks out always as the first priority and the first kind of thing that brings my attention about climate change, why we need to make a difference. It's for these communities that actually haven't contributed, as you've said, if at all, from an emissions perspective to the climate crisis, but are facing the brunt of it and having to adapt and migrate, even, forced migration in many cases. So that, I'd say for me, when I think of sustainability and climate change, it's always the human side that comes to mind first, and as a priority that perhaps we don't necessarily, when I say we, I mean in the broader sense in the industry and sector in the UK, think about as quantifiable in the work that we do, in the advisory services that we offer to large organizations, to think about in the same amount as, say, carbon emissions is given, or nature, biodiversity is given a priority.
Yeah. Well, we often notice a momentum around people's attention on these challenges when we have wildfires or floods or other such natural disasters that have have a various reasons why they were created, but are directly connected in some way to climate and bring our awareness to climate. And it's often those times where there is either the most empathy or the most awareness, or our attention is attracted. You had very real experience of that, and with your family as well. And I think that's perhaps been a very grounding experience for you, and one that, whilst not unique to you, would be perhaps more experienced by people from the global south than in other areas, although increasingly we will find it happening across countries throughout the world. Would you like to speak a little bit to that, to give people some sort of sense as one of your origin stories?
So, as I mentioned before, I'm from Punjabi background and heritage. So that's the northern region of India. And just last summer, when there were extreme floods that happened, Punjab were caught up in extreme flooding over a period of multiple weeks. My family actually were directly impacted by it. They are business owners. They're not necessarily part of sort of farming regions, which Punjab is known for. And, a lot of trade, I guess, financial means comes to Punjab through farming as an industry. But in that particular situation, it took them 24 hours to get home. They didn't have access to their car. It kind of stopped working given the floods. And they were in really dire situations. There had been landslides. And, hearing about their trauma and what they went through, I think was the first time I directly had heard a story from on the ground. And it really brought home how quickly the damage is happening, and it increased my feeling of connection to bringing about greater impact and trying to help. And when I say help, I don't mean from a perspective of, we're in the global north. I think often there's a feeling of, and there has been previously, of trying to have a cookie cutter solution that perhaps we think, or I think, might be the best solution on the ground in places within South Asia and the global south. However, I think on reflection, on speaking to families, speaking to communities on the ground, it goes so much more, and it requires so much more communication. It requires hearing from them on what the exact needs are and helping communities build that resilience to be able to get through these challenging situations that they're now faced with on a much more frequent basis. And I think we'll speak more to that kind of solution orientated approach and how to really bring about change that's needed.
It's often quite difficult, I feel, to have that contextual awareness unless one's really in that community. And even for yourself, who is connected, of course, to that community, but you're still one step removed from the very clear realities of living in that world. And I think that's one of the, as we've got sprawling global supply chains, much of what we receive comes from around the world, but we're all very, very clearly disconnected from that. And in this instance, we would be a consumer. I mean, of course, we're all citizens, but in this instance, as a consumer or as someone that receives either goods or services or food or something like this, your interaction is with a retailer, a brand, and that's where your relationship stops. You're not even really aware of the people that work in any of those organizations, really. Not in an intimate way. You might have a sense as to what that brand is, and they might show you some images of things that make you feel like you know what that brand is, but actually you're very disconnected. And then in that organization, you've often got a UK team, a global team, a large organization, which may not even know all the component pieces that go through all the people that are connected. And I'm not saying that it doesn't happen. I think a lot of people in these organizations are very aware, very acutely aware, but it's the layers of structure, the layers of people that really create this clear distance between being aware of things, perhaps through the media or through something similar to that, but actually really truly appreciating and understanding what's needed. And I guess that really speaks into what you're saying around growing a network of South Asians for Sustainability where you have that, where you're starting to recreate that or rebuild a social connected fabric that its roots come from those areas that perhaps are most effective in some instances. I mean, that feels so important to be able to hold that. I think it would be interesting to explore both sides of this. And so perhaps some of the challenges around engaging communities and perhaps some of the stories of maybe where we see it being successful. Let's move from there and evolve into the way we're looking at that as a global community. And I suppose there more specifically, we're looking at loss and damage and other areas where it's often very underfunded and often overlooked in many of these spaces as well. And that's quite a long run in to you sharing some things.
That's all good. No, I'm really glad that you also brought up the connection part to community, because I feel often when we look at media headlines or when we look at even reports, we see impact reports, we see different annual reports and case studies. And so much of the time, there's almost a dehumanization of the people in Global South, where until you hear firsthand stories like the one I've just shared, they seem so distant and so far away that really is what they're going through going to impact me directly. Like in my instance, yes, it's my family directly, but there's the way that language is used and stories are told and that representation in mainstream media, but also in our own industry, and what we advise, for example, to customers or clients to share in their impact reports. Does it really highlight the value of that human life in those regions? Does it really shine light on the fact that they don't necessarily have a say, or they don't necessarily have their stories highlighted to the same extent? And there's a lot here in terms of structures, and we've touched on a lot of inequalities already and the reasons for those inequalities. But I think, I think language plays a huge part, and perhaps it's something when we think about the challenge and potential solutions that are in place and where things are going well, how that issue is being tackled, because I think that human connection and that social network can only really grow in an impactful way when we evaluate and look internally. And when I speak for myself, looking at lives in the Global South as equal as those who are in the Global North. It's just something I wanted to highlight because I don't necessarily always see it in practice.
So I think it's interesting language. I think there's something as well around that if you want to get something into the media or if you want to have a story work well, it's often, or if a politician is going to share something or if someone's going to share something, it's often, I'm going to use this person's name. Maybe they're random. I just made it up. And I'm going to use this story. Even though the process is to highlight someone, it's actually quite dehumanizing because you're using a story to further something in some way, shape or form. But in reality, the question, what do you need, is rarely one that's covered or how can we help? And then for that to then be followed up by actually doing the thing that you've been asked to deliver or give or to share. I hadn't really thought about it until that moment, but I think that's perhaps one of the key challenges is we want to hear those stories as long as they help us to either feel something or feel like we're covering it. But in reality, do we really, really, truly want to act on what we've heard and do something about it beyond either signaling or something like that? And I think we've seen that happen quite significantly across a range of organizations, is that virtue signaling is much easier to do than actual on the ground transparency, championing, holding up, changing of practices. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. I think there's a lot of great people doing a lot of great work, but there's definitely an imbalance collectively in that sort of space. I think that nowhere is more stark than the challenges that we've had around the loss and damage fund, and just how difficult that's been for those voices to have to stand up and push and push and push and push and push. And perhaps you'd like to share a little bit for people about the loss and damage fund and some of your perspectives on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I do want to caveat in that when I first saw loss and damage come up in, I think it was COP27 now, the first time that it was mentioned and the fund was agreed, it did feel like a shift and a step forward to finally addressing the impacts of so many structures in history when we think about racialized histories of unequal resource use, colonialism, and how that's impacted these regions in the global south and further, and how even till date, the negative impacts of that and the disproportionately affected communities have been impacted in both the global north and the south. It did feel like finally there's acknowledgement of that, and that there needs to be a change and there needs to be a step forward. But when we look at the actual statistics and some of the loss and damage fund, particularly, I think it was from UNEP that it came out, combined adaptation and mitigation finance flows in 2020, it fell by $17 billion, short of the $100 billion pledge to developing countries. So that in itself highlights that although these pledges are made, and for me personally feeling that sense of, oh, okay, maybe this is a step forward, when it actually comes down to the finance and the support that's required reaching these communities, and furthering to our previous point, have those communities been actually spoken to and communicated with, and is this money something that is reaching them in a way that actually helps them? Is it providing the means that they need to build that resilience? That's a whole nother topic, but it shows that there's so much more to the process that perhaps isn't being addressed. It's not being reported on. It's not that communication and the barrier. Perhaps it's language, perhaps it's cultural differences that is causing different challenges in that process. But is it really having the impact that it intends to when the pledges are made? And I think that's where the crux is for me, and where further solutions and change is needed to really have that wider impact that things like the loss and damage fund intend to have.
Yeah, I think loss and damage also connects to climate adaptation as well. And we're seeing, significant amounts of money being put into mitigation. But, some of the stats around that, 90% of all climate finance in 2020 went exclusively to activities to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, which means that only 10% was going to climate adaptation. And yet these challenges around floods, storms, higher temperatures, forest fires, loss of livable land, food, water, loss of homes and existing livelihoods, that's a massive spread of challenges that are being underfunded. Roughly 50 billion in adaptation finance was tracked between 2019 and 2020, compared to 571 billion for mitigation. So there's still this big, big gap in what we see as the challenge and what we're funding as the challenge. And whilst we expect that to shift, to your point, it's quite easy to look at carbon and say, oh, I'm going to reduce my carbon by X tons and I'm going to pay X amount of money to reduce it by that. But these are much more intangible. They shouldn't really be seen as being intangible, but they're seen as being more intangible things, and perhaps also where maybe our conscience needs to be bigger and wider and more expansive. And actually that when it comes down to the crunch, there is a challenge there, I think, in the level of funding and attention and awareness on those challenges. And having convened people on these topics, probably the structural makeup of organizations and how to get the money to flow into these areas, I think that's one of the challenges, and that can be slow moving. Yeah, probably slower than it needs to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to highlight where things potentially have been working quite well, and what I've seen on engagement from, with different organizations on the ground in South Asia, I thought it would be relevant to kind of mention that now. So there is a filmmaker, Deej Phillips, who has covered off stories in different parts of India where funding has been received by organizations on the ground, and they're being applied in ways that truly help those communities. So as much as perhaps underfunded, wherever there is funding being received and where it's working well, I think it's really important to champion that and to highlight. One of which is Mahila Housing Trust, which improves the during heat waves and extreme weathers in different parts of India where, temperatures can soar up to 50 plus degrees Celsius each summertime. There are adapted ways of women having jobs and securing livelihoods for their families, as at the same time, from an insulation perspective, helping their houses stay cool, because on communication and engagement, they found what was holding those women back was actually the inability to work because it was so warm. So the housing trust was able to come in and provide sort of reflective solutions for the houses to keep them cool, which meant that a lot of garment workers and women in their houses could continue to work and maintain a livelihood. Whereas before, that funding would have never reached, the communication and engagement would have never happened with those communities, and that their struggles wouldn't have even been heard. That is a local trust, an organization, a foundation that is able to listen to the needs of that community and adapt and help them build greater resilience with the extreme temperatures that they're facing. So that's just one example of quite a few where things are going really well.
That's interesting. The future will be a patchwork of solutions. I feel the more that I explore this, the more that, some of the principles will be the same. Some of the ways of setting things up will be the same, but there'll be a patchwork of solutions that are relevant to those communities. And I love the idea of local foundations understanding the communities that they're supporting. And maybe this is a topic for us to explore in future episodes. There's perhaps a structural challenge there around how do you connect that very, very grassroots with what are significantly large, sort of unfathomably large, but probably unfathomably large amounts of money that probably when you break it down isn't unfathomably large, but there's the gap between I work in an institution that has lots of money to spend into I really understand the communities that I'm investing in and supporting. That's probably an interesting gap to understand and explore. And I would imagine there's people that are doing that well that maybe we need to explore and find. And in fact, if you're listening to this then and you have ideas about who they are, please do share them so we can highlight them. There are also some other examples you had of organizations making a difference as well. Would you like to talk a little bit about some of those?
Yeah, absolutely. One area that is, when we think about it within the UK, research orientated. I've recently had the opportunity to work with Northumbria University, who've conducted some really interesting research on climate change, adaptation, migration patterns between diaspora communities and those in the global south. So this research in particular connected up various researchers in Bangladesh, in Pakistan, in different parts of India, alongside faith-based grassroots organizations in the UK, such as Go Dharmic, Brahma Kumari's, Bahu Trust, where there is a lot of impact being had, but it's pretty undocumented or it's not formalized in the process. And for example, when we look at South Asian communities in particular, we know that there's huge underrepresentation in academic journals, in research, and professional roles more broadly in different institutes. So that was a key research project which tried to mitigate and I guess address that and it's the start of something really big, we're hoping. But some of those key areas that were explored, particularly on migration, is really interesting, and how faith plays a really large motivational factor in climate action within communities on the ground here and in the global south regions within South Asia. Whenever extreme events are seen, such as extreme flooding, like I mentioned, my family were impacted in Punjab, or different parts of South Asian regions. There's a lot happening currently with sea levels rising in the Maldives, same with cyclones in Bangladesh. The research looks at how different communities in the UK feel connected to those events, those communities on the ground, and how they help in those situations, often through fundraising and sending different means of support, and also highlighting how heritage and cultural roots really play a part in that building of the connection and community to be able to support people with food security and those who have forced migration in particular examples. So it's been really insightful to work with researchers who are seeing the direct impact, particularly from a migration perspective, and how that's impacting diaspora communities, whether that's in the UK, wider in European regions, also in North America.
I'm listening to Empire and really being expansive on, and also Rest is History around. There's been a number of episodes on colonialism, East India Company, East Africa Company, slavery, and just how integral that had been in moving as many things about that are both abhorrent and interesting to explore. But the movement of people in this context and how that moved people around the world and how in a curious way, there's an unintended benefit in that. There may be many benefits and negative things, but one intended benefit to see is that means that there's potentially more connection between communities in the UK or America or Germany or France or wherever, and communities in Southeast Asian countries, in India, in Africa. Well, that movement of population then now has this way of us being able to look at that. The exploration that's happening at the moment is reparation and looking at our colonial past and looking at elements like that. In reality, it's much more complex than just looking at it in a linear way. But if we can look at those things around how we can bring out some of the benefits of having such a movement of people through those times, then extending our empathy, being able to connect more to the communities, being able to create stronger roots with those communities, and as you're saying there, support those communities in ways, that feels like something that we can build from out of that challenge, which feels curious.
Absolutely. And yeah, I echo everything you've said. I think now, I guess I can share from a personal example. Growing up, I'm British born. I studied history up until A level, and at no point did I really get encouraged to look deeper into the history of colonial empire, how that has impacted communities across the UK to date. And it was only on further reading, watching different documentaries, learning more about my ancestral roots and history and what my family had to go through during the partition time in between Pakistan and India, that I really understood from a broader framework how that interlinks with the climate crisis today, and how the small things in everyday life, actually, you can look back at that path and look back at the trajectory and see how it impacts what we're dealing with today, especially when you look at global south regions and how they don't necessarily have as much resilience to deal with what they're being faced with. But I think, yeah, what you've mentioned in that cultural understanding, that wider education piece, it can really then, at least in me, instilled a much deeper connection with why it's important to bring about greater impact, to connect on that level, to talk about truly those different traumas and how that's impacting daily lives today, especially within South Asian communities in the UK that I've spoken to, that actually when they make those connections and associations, they can feel a lot more driven and motivated to think about how they're spending on a day-to-day, how they're consuming, what their choices are, how they can have a larger impact. So yeah, super interesting, and definitely something that's I'm seeing in engagement a lot more relevant to the younger generation.
That's curious. I think that's why it feels really important to be able to have healthy, open conversations about things that feel either challenging, difficult, or a bit edge. My personal belief is that there's lots from the past to learn from and much to take forward. And it's better to look at what we can do with that rather than anything else. And so I think that's extremely curious. So we've looked at some of your history. We've looked at how you choose to then show up in the world and what you manifest within the world based on your experience. We've looked at the larger theme around loss and damage, and we've looked at some of the solutions and some of theirs. I think it would be nice to, as we arrive into the closeout, to look at some of the principles that I think people could have as perhaps a takeaway. And there's been a few that have been through this. Maybe we could summarize some of those now for you, dear listener, to receive as something to hold or to build on yourself or to take into conversations that you have as well.
So number one for me, and one thing that I feel super passionate about, is coming back to representation within our workplace. And especially if we are in industries that are linked to climate change and linked to the climate crisis, how do we hold space to hear from communities that are impacted, like we've touched on, these networks and communities that are connecting to those in the global south? How are we hearing their stories through our workforce? How is that impacting the policies that we lay out? How is that truly that extra diverse voice? How is their perception and their perspective helping us shape the most holistic view on our solutions and what we're taking forward? So yeah, I think it's key for from my perspective on how we continue to bring about the greatest impact in our workplace, in the impact that we're having linked to the climate crisis, to nature-based solutions, and more holistically from a human rights perspective, having that story and having that perspective shown and heard from, I believe will really turn the dial on looking at the climate crisis in a way that is more equitable and truly bring about that shift that we need to make wider strides of impact.
Yeah, it really resonates with me. And I feel like for quite a while, we've looked at diversity and inclusion. I'm being very facile here, but perhaps as in race or gender or perhaps sexual orientation. And that's great. I think there should be general representation and people should support as many people as possible to be able to do as many things as they choose they want to be able to do. But what we're talking about here is an added layer of meaning to having a diverse workforce and a diverse community or diversity across any level of community, in that it helps us to be more empathetic. It helps us to create a world where all of us can thrive, and it helps us to really tune into that in a more deep and connected way. And that's a different way for diversity teams to look at diversity, I feel, which perhaps is often that connection between diversity and sustainability. I wonder if that's oft as made as much as it could be, or if you're in a sustainability team and you're hiring, are you thinking about that as a component piece of how you're hiring? Perhaps you are, but also perhaps not necessarily. And I think if we go one step deeper as well, how much are we doing as a movement, as a profession, to be able to support more people, to be able to have the level of knowledge that's required to enter into the roles that they could play a meaningful role? Of course, it's useful to be able to listen to people, but also how are we empowering people to play a meaningful role, I think is very important. Okay, so we've talked about diversity and bringing more diversity into the communities and places of work that we have, and also in political representation, please, as well. It's hugely important. And there, specifically, empathy is very important. And I think what's been most tragic about the diversity that we're seeing in the political establishment in the UK is the lack of empathy where one would expect to feel and hear it the most. And that's been just a tragedy and a complete dereliction of any sense of moral duty. It's been awful. So less of that, and definitely more empathy and connection and diversity within our representation in all parts of life is one thing we're calling for. One of the things I feel that we could talk about is, and it's probably the biggest challenge that we face, is behavior change and drivers. Maybe drivers is the right word in some ways, but it's going to be the word I'm going to use. So like the things that motivate us or make us feel like we want to consistently act in a way that's aligned with the topics that we're talking about. So acting on climate, being more sustainable, being more socially minded, those elements. So I really loved when you touched upon that and talking about the way that there's a sort of blossoming of awareness in those communities, being from those diaspora communities. I think that's really lovely. And I'm curious about how we could support more of that to happen.
So I think, it links back into what you mentioned as well about hiring and increasing the amount of people working in this space. So I've seen a huge change within South Asian communities who are wanting to enter more purpose-led and purpose-driven roles within this space. And I think that comes from, one, an increased amount of education. So they feel that, they want to give back in some way, shape or form. There's also the ability and privilege from a financial stability perspective that they can think about jobs that previously perhaps wouldn't have supported them financially or as much. And I think that's something I've seen as a massive change within South Asian communities, particularly within diaspora. The more they're educated, the more they feel connected and motivated to the cause, to those communities that are in the global South regions. They are shifting the kinds of jobs and careers that they're going for, which is why through South Asians for Sustainability, the Spotlight series that we run is so, pivotal and important, because I feel when you see that representation and you hear from them very authentically, you can associate to what kind of job roles or what kind of career or a space you can enter as a different type of job and career choice, which was not necessarily the case when you look at the stats, particularly on ethnic diversity, although that's one of many important parts of diversity, there wasn't much at all when you look 20 years ago of people of color in this space. And that's growing and growing. So that in itself as well is, I feel, changing a lot of the landscape, and something that as colleagues, as peers within the industry, we can continue to encourage and shout out about.
That's fascinating. And when you then talk about that, what I'm thinking about is community work or community-based activities, or what typically may have been CSR or the community-based teams. And I think that's got a lot of evolution in it, in terms of how communities of people that work in organizations are engaging in their local communities. And there feels like one could be more intentional there around creating a sense of togetherness with diaspora communities. And like at the moment, I'm not saying it's always this way, but in some ways, community-based activity can be a little bit haphazard, a little bit driven by either the person that's thinking about the activity they want to make, or sometimes a little bit linear in its approach. When what we're talking about here, there could be a more connected, a deeper sort of level of connection with community that would have, I don't particularly like this word, co-benefits, and those co-benefits being a deeper understanding of broader communities around the world. And so one of the challenges that I see is that you've got maybe a global footprint of an organization or a country, and you've got maybe a UK-based team or a country-based team, and actually then your ability to be able to connect globally is somewhat limited because it's not within your sphere. But what we're exploring here is that you could work with diaspora communities in a way that was connected to the work that you did around community, and in so doing have a deeper connection to some of the themes that we've talked about here. And I feel like then by doing that, you're also then increasing the opportunities to have diversity in the community that is your workforce, because you're building better relationships. So there's a whole load of better ways to think about how we might engage with communities in the work that we do, either as organizations or as community group organizers, I suppose, which I think I know that's not happening in that full way across everything. So I think that's definitely a space for people to explore.
When you think of people of color in nature spaces and in forests and walking out in green spaces a lot of the research post-COVID has shown the lack of access to green spaces and making those parts of our country more welcome. There's a lot of conservation groups as well that I know of that are really trying to bridge that gap and bring more people of color into green spaces and think about conservation in a way, from an impact perspective. So that bridge of community building on a local level as well, I can definitely see. I've already seen how much more change is coming about, slowly but surely. And I know there's a huge drive to bring community together of all walks of life, to think about climate in a different way and respecting kind of the spaces that we live in. So yeah.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about the global south, and in the reality is more mixed than that. I think there's people that live in many cities or areas of the UK or other countries that actually will face many of the challenges of climate change and often be less resourced to be able to cope with that. I don't know the exact stats, but for example, Tower Hamlets in London, which is deeply affected by air pollution, for example. But if you live in Tower Hamlets, maybe you're not able to move out of Tower Hamlets to live somewhere else. So there's many parts of the world are being affected by these challenges. And I think thinking about that in a more deep and thoughtful way and involving and engaging people in those communities through the world that are either the most marginalized or the most affected or the most challenged, and thinking about how we can ask them what they need and wholly welcome them in an equitable way to be part of the world that we want to build together.
The only thing that came to my mind was the recent WEF Global Risk Report. It was released a few days ago, but I know I've gone to from a professional lens quite a lot, but I feel in that space, it's only since from a regulation and framework perspective with CSRD and the new IFRS standards, that social sustainability and environmental climate is really being seen together. So it basically just talks about risks in a way the interlinks between everything. And I always find like in conversations, it is a really good framework to base discussion off of when things are in silos. So it was mainly that point on how currently we see things in silos or often work like carbon emissions, very like tunnel vision, and not considering how that's interlinked with polarization in society or economic opportunity or cost of living, for example.
Yeah, so that's fantastic. So you're referencing the World Economic Forum's Global Risks Report from 2024, which has just been released and is hot topic reading for professionals in our space. And you're right. I think it's very articulate in how it shares, and we will include a link to that in the show notes so people can dive into it.
I think last year as well, they had one which started to look at the real interlinks between societal and environmental topic areas. And I love like there's a graphic of the web and how it all like connects to each other.
One of the best intervention points in organizations is having risks accurately tracked at board level and through the business as well. It's curious how often that doesn't happen and how much of a gap that is.
Yeah, for sure. I think I do feel like the environmental and societal points, like you mentioned, with previously known as CSR or community impact, is often so much more in silo compared to things like nature-based solutions and carbon emissions. So it is from a business perspective to think about risk in a more holistic way, and really how people are impacted by the climate crisis, I think would shift the dial majorly as well, and strategically how things are worked around and changed.
So no longer in silos, everything's connected, we're all connected. The world we would like to create is connected. And it's only when we start to understand and make those connections that we can truly create a world which is balanced, fair, and just. That feels like the answer that we should all be holding as some sort of guiding light or compass for how we make decisions within our organizations or communities that we are in. Vib, such a pleasure to explore the theme with you. I feel grateful that you are creating the world that you're creating and grateful for the community that you hold, and feel very happy to support anything that you choose that you need.
Thank you so much, Carl. As always, a pleasure to speak, and thank you for having me on. Excited to see the kind of impact that we can have collectively and in the world of work that we so often cross paths on.
Please like, rate and share this widely on your social channels. The more people that we can welcome to join us on the journey and support the change makers we champion, the faster we can combat climate change, battle biodiversity loss, and co-create a future we can all love.
Where do we go next? What questions did this spark for you? Would you like to know more about a particular topic? Who shall we adventure to? What shall we ask them? Where shall we go? What shall we build? How shall we do this together? Do you have any questions or comments? Join the Future Planet community of action at futureplanet.love to sign in, sign up, and get involved. Together, we can.